Then thank you very much. Now I hear the recording in progress. Okay, that's a prompt to start. All right, on behalf of the IUCN U.S. National Committee, very pleased to welcome you to this virtual event with the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, on the Glasgow Declaration. Very topical issue with the upcoming UAE Climate COP. I'm Scott Hajos. I am the co-chair of the Policy and Strategy Subcommittee and member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. National Committee. I represent the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition and the National Whistleblower Center within IUCN. I'm pleased to introduce Jennifer Skane as our first speaker. I've gotten to know Jen over the past few months, and we've been collaborating a lot on different things, but Jen is a Natural Climate Solutions Policy Manager with NRDC, where she works across global policy to address forest degradation in northern forests. Jennifer advocacy elevates the long overlooked climate and biodiversity impacts of industrial logging in boreal and temporal forests, and addresses deeply embedded global paradigms that allow developed countries to avoid scrutiny for their forest impacts. We first came into contact when Debbie Good, the manager of the office, and I attended NRDC, the film on issue with tissue on industrial logging in boreal forests and the impacts on indigenous people and forest caribou. So it's been a really interesting journey here the past few months to get these places. And I think we're going to look forward to another, hopefully hybrid event on that boreal forest work in BC in Canada. Jennifer is also a clinical lecturer at Yale Law School, and I just learned this. She's a fellow member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, so lots of things to talk about through the commission as well. But without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Jen for the rest of the program and introduce our second speaker. Thank you very much, Jen and NRDC. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to IUCN USNC for hosting this event. Really thrilled that we could have this conversation and this presentation in advance of COP28, which is coming up in just a couple of weeks, given how relevant these issues are going to be in Dubai. Before I get started on my presentation, I do want to introduce my co-speaker today, who will be speaking after I've given my presentation. KM Reyes is a conservation lobbyist, community organizer, and National Geographic explorer based on Palawan Island, known as the Philippines' last biodiversity frontier. She is co-founder of the women-led youth frontline organization, Center for Sustainability, PH, whose mission is to conserve the Philippines' last remaining 3% of pristine rainforests through legal establishment of protected areas. CS also leads the Southeast Asia 30 by 30 campaign, which successfully lobbied for the Philippines to join the High Ambition Coalition to protect 30% of global land and water, a tremendous achievement. She is also project manager, Asia Pacific, at the global reforestation charity One Tree Planted, supporting frontline groups in landscape restoration in a dozen countries across the region. KM also sits on the advisory committee of the Forest Declaration Platform, dedicated to turning commitments into action under the New York Declaration on Forests and the Glasgow Leaders Declaration. And I'll actually mention in my presentation how that Forest Declaration Platform intersects and complements some of what we'll be talking about today with the Glasgow Declaration Accountability Framework. So KM, thank you so much for joining us today, and looking forward to hearing you speak. With that, I will go ahead and share my screen. Let's see if I can. Hopefully that is coming through. So yeah, I'm particularly excited to talk to fellow IUCN members about this initiative around the Glasgow Declaration Accountability Framework, given how much momentum there is right now within the organization around bringing together the biodiversity and the climate fights, and really taking steps to create integrated, synergistic solutions. So we are about maybe a week and a half or so away from the start of the climate COP, or COP28 in Dubai. And this year's COP is particularly centered around this global stocktake process. that looks at where we are globally now, 8 years after the signing of the Paris Agreement, looks at where we're failing and what needs to change to really chart a better path. And so this COP is really about accountability. This year's COP is also the 2-year anniversary of the signing of the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use. Signed by 145 countries, it's committed signatories to halt and reverse deforestation and land degradation by 2030. And what the Glasgow Leaders Declaration really did is it signaled very unprecedented cooperation around truly global action to protect the world's climate and biodiversity critical forests. And with its 2030 commitments, it created that mechanism for really aligning necessary action around forest protection with corresponding 2030 climate and biodiversity targets. So it was an incredibly powerful development. Unfortunately, when we take stock of where we are on the Glasgow Leaders Declaration, the picture is a little bit bleak. A WRI report from a few months ago showed that in 2022, primary forest loss in the tropics actually increased, with actually all-time high rates in some countries. The Forest Declaration Assessment, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, painted a similarly alarming picture. And critically, that Forest Declaration Assessment also covered this year continued impacts that are not confined to the tropics. Across the global north, countries like Canada, countries like Sweden continue to see very high rates of degradation of their own high integrity forests. But it's relatively early days for the Glasgow Leaders Declaration. But when you look at really the fundamentals of where we are, it's very clear that systemically, the international community is not positioned currently to meet those 2030 targets. So we have a new agreement, but without new mechanisms of really ensuring progress and creating a stronger foundation, there's a very strong risk that it'll end up in the same place as the New York Declaration, which unfortunately failed to achieve its targets in time. And of course, we have no time left for that to happen. So before I get into what the Glasgow Declaration Accountability Framework does, I want to just talk a little bit about what it's trying to address. And there are a number of systemic flaws that are really hindering implementation of the Glasgow Declaration, and we'll cover myriad of those today. But one particularly insidious feature of modern environmental policy has been the inequity in accountability and responsibilities between the global north and the global south. So across modern environmental policy, really for the last 30 plus years, the international community's attention has been almost exclusively focused on deforestation in the tropics. Meanwhile, some of the fastest rates of forest degradation have been occurring in northern forests. So in the past 2 decades, industrial logging in northern forests has been the single largest driver of tree cover loss in the world, which you can see from this WRI chart here. Canada, for example, clear cuts more than 1.3 million acres of forests annually. Sweden clear cut nearly 1/4 of its unprotected old growth forests between 2003 and 2019. And at current rates is on track to wipe out its last old growth forests by 2070. And of course, in the United States as well, logging projects encompassing hundreds of thousands of acres of federal lands continue to threaten mature and old growth forests. And while some of what's logged, unlike deforestation, ostensibly comes back, sort of the narrative really rests on this idea that trees are renewable, trees regrow. Losing high integrity forests, particularly ones as carbon dense as those in the global north, has irremediable impacts. Once you clear cut a primary forest, it doesn't matter how many trees you replant, that forest is irrecoverable. This real hemispheric policy gap hasn't just meant that we're overlooking some of the most critical drivers of degradation in the world. It's also hindered greater ambition in the tropics. So it's led to confusion around the meaning of scientific terms as northern countries have tried to really contort them around their own industry interests. And it's also really hindered the creation of truly global supply chain standards, or, to the extent that it does, it places developing countries at a real disadvantage, making them much less likely to take action. Just to highlight a main way that this sort of manifests, or big reason for why this global inequity exists, is that the picture on the left constitutes deforestation. The picture on the right does not. So the picture on the left is deforestation in the tropics. The picture on the right is a clear cut in Ontario in Canada. And again, the difference in the terms is deforestation is narrowly defined to only include the actual conversion of a forest to an entirely different land use, so something like a palm oil plantation or a cattle ranch. Whereas, again, the myth with logging is that you can clear cut a forest and it is still technically a forest, because the idea is that trees will eventually return. So you can be standing in the middle of a clear cut like the one you see in the picture. There's no trees anywhere near you, and somehow you're still under this legal fiction in a forest. So turning back to where this leaves us with the Glasgow Declaration, in order to really position Glasgow to achieve what past agreements haven't, the international community really needs to reckon with this fundamental inequity, along with other policy flaws and inefficiencies, through really building cooperative accountability mechanisms that's going to foster meaningful action and really provide checks to progress along the way. So making sure we're not just tackling deforestation, we're also addressing things like degradation on the right, and that that degradation is defined in a robust and globally applicable way. And so that's why NRDC, along with a growing coalition of organizations, government officials, and community leaders, are calling on signatories to the Glasgow Leaders Declaration to develop a Glasgow Declaration accountability framework. And this is really a recognition that spurring that global achievement of the targets is going to require accountability measures that bring together the best of existing policy, but while establishing new processes and modes of alignment and filling in those gaps and issues where they exist to really foster equitable shared action. The Glasgow Declaration Accountability Framework really has 3 pillars, and these are around building transparency, facilitating policy and public finance commitments, and alignment around common standards and metrics. So I won't go too much into the technical details. I can paste a link to a webpage that we have that will provide some of those more technical details. But just to walk through each of the pillars quickly and what they would do. With the transparency piece, so the idea is, as with UNFCCC greenhouse gas reporting, signatories would submit annual reports, which would cover rates of deforestation, rates of degradation, rates of restoration, and other associated metrics, like things like primary and old growth forest loss. You'd have a designated scientific body that would review these reports to really ensure alignment and progress over time. Developed countries would also then commit to additional monitoring investments to address global data gaps. So on the global inequity piece, not only is much of what's happening in the global north not captured in global policy, but countries aren't even looking into what's happening. So for example, Canada doesn't publicly report on its rates of primary forest loss, and to our knowledge doesn't track this at all. So filling in those data gaps that are really essential to actually knowing if we are on track to meet those 2030 commitments to halting and reversing deforestation and land degradation. And these investments should really include the latest in remote sensing technologies, as well as on-the-ground assessments, particularly from Indigenous peoples and local communities. The second pillar is around facilitating policy and public finance. So this is around bringing together signatories to collaborate around best practices and align on different policy commitments that are going to help to create that better foundation to support the Glasgow Declaration's overarching goals. So things like investments, committing to investments in Indigenous-led land protection and sustainable economies, and phasing out harmful subsidies for practices that are not in alignment with Glasgow. And similarly, commitments from developed countries to greater public financing of actions in developing countries. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of pledges over the years, and far too little of that has actually materialized. So really building that into this accountability framework. And then the last piece is around alignment. So this is really trying to articulate that these problems are global, these dynamics are global. We need common metrics, definitions, and data sources to really be driving comprehensive, equitable action. So things like ensuring that we're all on the same page, that degradation, for example, encompasses things like loss of primary forests. Ensuring that countries that are signed on from the global north are articulating that they understand that this mechanism applies to them and to their own forests. And then also on the alignment piece is alignment around climate and biodiversity targets. So I mentioned this at the top as something that IUCN is certainly really leading efforts on, but there's parallel commitments in the biodiversity and the climate space that are all sort of rowing in the same direction, but they haven't really been brought together in any meaningful policy sense. So using this accountability framework to build that connective tissue between the two priorities. So those are the three pillars. Back in August, the African Ministerial Conference of the Environment actually issued a declaration calling for the GDAF as, quote, a means of driving global progress and promoting greater equity between forest protection standards. And this really perfectly sums up what the GDAF would do. It would align the international community around an equitable policy landscape and better position delivery of the Glasgow Declaration. One thing I just want to quickly throw up this slide, and not to get too technical, but there's been, one thing to note about the accountability framework is it's not trying to reinvent the wheel. Where processes already exist, where there's already data collection, where countries are already reporting on certain things through, some of the bodies that I've indicated up here, like the FAO, through the CBD. All of those would, continue to serve their function and to feed that data and those processes into what we envision resting with the FCLP. So the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, which is a voluntary partnership of 26 countries that launched last year around delivering on the Glasgow Declaration goals. So where those reporting requirements already exist and processes already exist, those will feed into FCLP oversight, who will then gauge them against 2030 targets and under the lens of the Glasgow Declaration. So what the GDAF does is it really brings those together and then fills in key gaps in those processes that need to be addressed in order to meet those targets, while also providing a forum for some of these policy developments and other conversations that need to be happening. And then because I've gotten a lot of questions about how the Forest Declaration Assessment fits in, which is something that KM sits on the advisory board for, and we've been in, NRDC was involved with this year, which is a really critical annual assessment that comes out from a coalition of civil society groups looking at international progress on meeting goals around the New York Declaration and now the Glasgow Declaration. And there have been questions, well, doesn't this already serve this function? And we see these things as very complementary, but serving very different purposes. So the GDAF would build in government processes for developing this data and building in some of those mechanisms for collecting it, as well as also the two other pillars around alignment and facilitating policy and public financing is certainly outside the FDA's wheelhouse. But then the FDA would serve a really critical role of continuing its oversight of how this is going, looking at this from that civil society perspective and making sure everything is on track and operating in the best way possible. The last thing I'll mention before I turn it over to KM is that the tools this is not only urgently needed from an environmental standpoint, but it's also ideally aligned with broader trends in policymaking and the marketplace. So I already mentioned the felicitous timing around the global stock take, but there's also been myriad other policy developments like the EU deforestation regulation that now really necessitate that companies have access to the data that they need to be meeting these standards, and certainty around global definitions and global standards and metrics. And the GDAF would help to establish those for use in the marketplace. And for meeting growing expectations around investors as well that they have for companies and their own supply chain commitments on forests. So yeah, the GDF is not only functioning from an environmental standpoint, but really working to build the marketplace. And we're at this really profoundly important moment for forests, and the actions the international community takes over the next year around constructing these stronger policy frameworks are really going to dictate the future of our forests and our planet. So this is about building accountability, it's creating alignment, and creating new tools to facilitate that really transformative change. And it's also about equity. So with that, I will stop and pass it over to KM.
Cool. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jen and Scott, for having me. Yeah, I'm KM. I'm dialing in from Canberra, Australia, so I'm a little bit cold. I'm used to warmer temperatures. But yeah, I'll jump right in and share my screen. Here we go. Right at the top. Yeah, so I thought before I jump into kind of specifically perspectives from Southeast Asia regarding the GDAF, I'd love to step back a little bit and tell you a little bit about the Philippines and remind all of us why we're all here. What's going on in my, here we go. Yeah, so just some quick background for those of you who are not so familiar with the Philippines. It's one of 17 mega biodiverse countries in the world, and originally it was 95% covered in pristine rainforest. Just a very quick run through here of some very important and notable charismatic species that we have in the Philippines. And a special note here that I've got our IUCN classification, so you all know where we stand. So these are just some of the mammals, birds, and herpetofauna that we have in the Philippines. Now, unfortunately, despite all this incredible biodiversity that we hold, only 3% of Philippine forests are actually left. So this is one of the deforestation sites, and it is deforestation, not degradation, that we logged about 6 years ago in the middle of our protected area site at the top of a watershed. So just the kinds of deforestation that we're dealing with are really serious, which you can see. This is our small team with a Centre for Sustainability PH, and we basically formed as a result of the deforestation that we were seeing in our own backyard in Palawan. And so the Centre for Sustainability, we're a women-led youth environmental nonprofit from Palawan. As Jen highlighted earlier, we're known as the Philippines' last biodiversity frontier. So if you look at that last 3% of pristine rainforest that's left, the last strongholds are on the island of Palawan. And so we've made it our mission to conserve land and protect its last remaining 3% of rainforest through establishment of protected areas. We do this specifically from communities, for communities, and to communities. And all of my colleagues that I showed you previously in the other slide are either from the Indigenous communities that we work with or local communities on Palawan Island. So we're a super, super local organization. Back in 2017, after 4 years of lobbying, of scientific research, of community consultation, we established the Cleopatra's Needle Critical Habitat. So it's 1,600 meters above sea level and over 40,000 hectares of pristine rainforest. So it's a huge area. It's about 2.5 times the size of Washington, DC. We're looking at 61 endemic species just to the island of Palawan, 31 IUCN globally threatened species, and this is just at a summary rapid biodiversity assessment. And it's also the ancestral domain of the disappearing Batak tribe. So this is a tribe where only 200 members are left. So something like the pandemic was extremely deadly for the Batak tribe and extremely threatening. I would say that the Batak tribe is even more threatened than many of the species that we're trying to protect. And Cleopatra's Needle is the Philippines' biggest critical habitat now. So it's a really special area. Critical habitats, which sit under the Wildlife Act in the Philippines, are generally very small areas, but we were able to show that it's a really, really important area and critical to the survival of so many species that require protection. So this is the law that was signed in. And just very briefly, so it's a 3-step process for establishing areas, protected areas in the Philippines. So it requires community organizing, scientific research, and then with the support of the communities and the proof of science, we come in and we lobby our decision makers from the local to the national level. And just very quickly about some other work that we're doing now in the Philippines. We are suckers for punishment. So we're looking for another protected area in the southern Philippines, in southern Palawan. It's a much smaller area, it's about 8,000 hectares. And a key reason for that is that it's also one of our key kind of players are mining companies for nickel mining, so the electric vehicle supply chain. And the Philippines is the most dangerous country in Southeast or in Asia for land defenders like myself. So we're trying to start small and see how we go before we go for as ambitious as we did with Cleopatra's Needle. And the other big campaign that we're doing out of CS is also the 30 by 30 campaign, which is obviously a target that was agreed upon at the UN Biodiversity Convention last December. And yeah, to protect 30% of land and water. But now moving across to the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use and why this is really important for us as a frontline organization. And what I really want to be able to provide here is a snapshot of, Jen provided a great perspective of what's going on in the global north. And what I'm hoping to provide here is kind of what it means from a very frontline perspective. What the kind of work that we're doing is really holding the line of our last pristine rainforests around the world, and specifically in the global south, in Southeast Asia, which is obviously one of the most important bastions of global biodiversity that's left. So specifically with the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, I just wanted to highlight some of the key takeaways that we took from it back in 2021 as a frontline organization, which I will also posit for many of the frontline organizations, not just in Southeast Asia, but across Latin America and Africa, were some of the key things that we really saw as valuable and that we want to be pushing forward, whether it's through the accountability framework or other ways of holding our local governments or our national governments accountable. And these are fourfold. So firstly, we saw that there was vocal recognition to support Indigenous peoples and local communities, and really recognizing that we do depend on forests for livelihood and have a key role in stewardship. Facilitating trade and development policies that do not drive deforestation and land degradation. And this is obviously something that we see in Southeast Asia a lot. And that was one of the figures, that the tables that Jen showed, that, for example, in Southeast Asia, commodity deforestation, is responsible for 90% of the deforestation in Southeast Asia. So it's really a key policy that needs improvement. Recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. This is huge and overarching in all of the work that we do at CS, but that you will see, we're seeing now at all levels, including at the IUCN. There was a lot of vocalization around that at the last World Conservation Congress in Marseille. And then finally, reaffirming increasing finance to support IPLCs in forest management, conservation and restoration. And this is really, really important for us at CS. We're a really small organization, very under-resourced, but have proven that we can achieve great things with just a little bit of financing. And so zooming out a little bit from the Philippines, for today, when I talk about Southeast Asia, I really want to focus on Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, we are the 3 mega biodiverse states of Southeast Asia, and as a result of that, a lot of the negotiations at the UN biodiversity and climate negotiations do kind of, when ASEAN as a group are in discussion or in negotiations at these COPs, we do tend to center around these three key players in terms of leading policy statements and interventions. So the three countries are signatories to the Glasgow Declaration. We are mega biodiverse states of Southeast Asia, which I've highlighted. And Indonesia specifically, which I think we're all pretty aware of, is seen as one of the three global forest giants globally. So back at COP27, you had the alliance that was formed by Brazil and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there's a lot more policy work that I think is going to be coming out of this alliance moving forward, and I'm very interested to see what they come out with at COP28, because this is definitely going to be a leading policy country, and in terms of shifting the negotiations and what these three countries are going to be pushing against, Indonesia is going to be definitely a leader in that. In terms of trends, I do want to highlight that according to WRI or Global Forest Watch, forest and tree cover loss has actually been decreasing, not markedly, but it has been decreasing in Indonesia and Malaysia. Although there was, in the Philippines, there was also a decrease, except for last year in 2022, and that's also been as a result of lots of changes, policy changes with regards to serving the commodities sector, which is the primary driver of deforestation, farming, and I will say specifically in the Philippines, a big part of that has been a change in mining concessions. So again, going back to what Jen was saying, there is this huge push and pull between the global north and the global south, whether that's commodities and kind of, you know, this green energy and green sustainability market that is being pushed at the global north level, but a lot of that is in consequence and being pushed upon global south countries, especially in Southeast Asia. So I want to zoom in now and kind of just highlight what I see to finish off. What are the challenges to achieving some of these pillars that Jen highlighted previously with regards to the accountability framework for the Global Declaration? So firstly, looking at the first pillar, so transparency. I do want to highlight, and I think this is something that I see time and again when I'm at negotiations at the biodiversity and climate COPs, and seems really far away, but is actually very real when you're in the delegation and you are lobbying. So firstly, there is an absolute lack of culture of transparency in Southeast Asia in general. And that's a cultural thing. There's a big cultural standard in Southeast Asia around losing face. So one of the biggest issues that we came up against specifically for 30 by 30 was that we did not want to be ambitious because we didn't feel that we were going to be able to achieve 30% protection of lands and water by 2030. And so why would we set ourselves up for failure? So these are really concrete issues that we need to look at with regards to the accountability framework and bringing in Southeast Asia specifically, looking at goals that are actually attainable, or the language being created in such a way that we're not going to be losing face, because that's going to be a big part of getting buy-in. Another thing which Jen also highlighted, and I couldn't stop nodding my head across, which was that we want to see transparency from the global north. We might not necessarily speak about it publicly in interventions. You'll often see there's much more outspokenness happening from Africa or from Latin America. And I think that's got a lot to do as well with proximity to Europe and to North America. So there's a lot more acceptance about being outspoken with regards to transparency from the global north. But this is something that absolutely I see all the time in the corridors of government when I am lobbying and advocating, that they're always saying, well, why do we need to do it when the global north isn't doing it anyway? So that's going to be a key part of the accountability framework, and the global north really putting the first foot forward in showing how they're being transparent at a global level. There is limited direct engagement that I see at the national government in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and in the Philippines with Indigenous peoples and local communities in general. So there was, we're talking a lot about in the accountability framework, engaging IPLCs, especially around reporting and on-ground assessments. The Philippines, as well as Indonesia, is an archipelago state, and Malaysia doesn't actually recognize that they have Indigenous peoples. So that's a whole other ball game that we are dealing with at the negotiations level, whether that's at international or at the local level. And then finally, we do have limited capacity as well. And this is where the financing always comes in. And, Southeast Asia always wants to see the global north chipping in for this kind of work. And I just wanted to highlight very briefly around transparency attitudes, just how in the Corruption Perceptions Index, kind of how local populations see corruption and transparency in general in Southeast Asia. So the highest is Malaysia. They see their state as being kind of the cleanest, and the Philippines is the lowest at 33%. But it's definitely way beyond what we would call like a passing grade in terms of what we see as clean and a transparent state, even despite lots of laws that have come into place over the years. In terms of policy, facilitation, and finance, again, what I want you're going to see a running theme through all of these pillars with the accountability framework. We do want to see investment from the global north, and we want to see clear and again, transparent policies around the global north. I think what happened in the EU was a really big and important step. I also recognize that Malaysia and Indonesia specifically were very outspoken around the policies that came out of the EU this year regarding that. But that's, again, the transparency and the investment part is going to be a key part of this pillar. We do require significant guidance from the global north. I will say that just in terms of what I've seen, again, behind closed doors and in terms of developing our NDCs, developing our NBSAPs. A lot of this stuff is coming from the global north at conferences that are very skewed toward global north leanings. And so even though often Southeast Asia and specifically Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines will just remain quiet because we also culturally don't want to rock the boat. We do agree on, or we will tacitly agree on a lot of the policies and accords that come out. But then often when it comes down to applying it on the ground, we're not exactly sure how we're supposed to do it. And so I have seen specifically, and that this is where the CSO network is very important, that there is actually a lot of hand holding that has to be done. And that's definitely going to be the case for this. And a very real recognition that in Southeast Asia, we do not only have a burgeoning population, but very frankly, we are very focused on economic growth. We've totally taken on board capitalism, and we are very interested in increasing our market share. And you see that with our tiger economies. And so there is a lot less interest in looking at concrete trade-offs that will result in losses, because we do very much want to be able to be on par with what we see as global north advancements, and we want to be able to match those. We are very competitive. We don't want to lose face. And so at a very real level, this is something that is going to be a real challenge. And then finally, with the financing piece, there is absolutely a lack of developed and tried and tested mechanisms for directly investing in IPLCs. And this is another thing where local governments are really struggling, even though they're seeing that there's all this language happening at the global level now of investing in IPLCs. And the Philippines, actually, we're very lucky. We have the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. So we have Indigenous people's rights enshrined in our laws. But in terms of how to turn that into action, especially from a financing point of view, corruption aside, we don't even know how to do it. And so this is where the hand-holding is also going to be really important. And then finally, alignment. So internally, there's a lot of room for improvement with coordination of ministries engaged at the UN Climate and Biodiversity Conventions. Now there's a lot more language and understanding that there is a huge gap there that needs to be addressed. I would argue that a few years ago, they didn't talk to each other and didn't really understand or see the urgency to do it. Whereas now, because of the discussions that are happening at the global level, there is a lot more talk about it. And the CSO movement has been a really key part of ensuring that there is more discussion between the ministries. But the other big part of it is also, though, that kind of coordination also flowing down to the local government, because as I mentioned before, we are archipelago states, except for Malaysia, and a lot of it is decentralized. So if you don't have that coordination flowing down to the local government, it's just absolutely not going to be implemented at all. So that's a big part. Again, with the alignment for Southeast Asia to want to even align with the global north on this declaration, they're going to want to see that the global north are leading on, specifically around the reporting, because I think a big part again is that Southeast Asia does not want to report on things that we're doing that, you know, aren't at global standard, but we're definitely not going to want to do it if the global north is not doing that. And then finally, a really key part, which I have argued for many years, is another reason why we have so many issues in Southeast Asia, is that we're looking at, from a geographic point of view, we're just so far away. So all of you are dialing in today on, what day is today? Friday. So Thursday evening, here I am, you know, 16 hours ahead. We're on a different wavelength, basically, on so many levels. So time differences are really important, and really make a big difference. Language and cultural barriers are also really, really challenging, even for me. As a Filipina, you know, when I'm working with Indonesia and with Malaysia, they speak completely different languages from me, even though we're neighbors. And so this is even something from a lobbying perspective and a negotiations perspective that is really, really difficult. And then finally, the in-person engagement, because of the fact that we are so far away, and often a lot of this moving and shaking does happen in the global north, whether it's Europe or the US, we are much further away than Latin America and Africa. And so you will also see that the engagement and presence, a big reason why CS has become so involved with the global negotiations is because often our team are the only ones on panels that are representing Southeast Asia, or are the only women, Asian women, in the room, even, you know, looking at negotiations at the global level. And so this is another issue that we deal with, and we deal with on a very real level when engaging with the government, because they're not sending their delegations, or they're not sending sizable delegations that can make a real impact, whether it's an understanding what's going on at the global level or actually influencing what's happening on the global level. So yeah, I think I'm at time, or probably after time. So I will leave it there and hand it back to Jen and Scott. Thank you.
Thank you so much, KM. Just amazing presentation, and just such a important perspective to be aware of as we sort of move forward with these conversations and go into COP28. So thank you for that. I know we have about 15 minutes left or so. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or type them in the chat. Yeah, Scott.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I just want to say thank you very much, both of you. That was fascinating presentations, including the very interesting perspectives, KM, from your part of the world. I actually on some boards where I got to deal with these time differences all the time, and sometimes I draw the short straw at 6 a.m. here in DC time to accommodate Australians. But there's a couple things I wanted to say. One, you mentioned the Marseille Congress, and there is a resolution on deforestation and agricultural commodity supply chains. It's resolution 108. Jen and I have been in touch on this. We've been trying for a year and a half to get IUCN and the Secretariat implement this resolution, to start implementing it. I'm just going to read two quickly passages on it. It has a lot of requests to the private sector, governments, et cetera, but it does request the Director General and IUCN commissions to work with FAO, the ITTO, et cetera, on the collaborative partnership on forests to combat illegal timber trade, promote legal and transparent supply chains. The Director General and the Commission on Environmental, Economics, and Social Policy are supposed to work with mining impacts, agricultural impacts, corruption, which you've mentioned. I think we have really been trying to get the person who is working on this to move forward on it. It falls somewhere between the private sector dimensions of IUCN and the forest sector. So I just would encourage members to really make a push for IUCN to move forward on implementing this very important resolution, because it's a contributor and it helps the organization organize itself in this whole effort. That's just one thing I wanted to mention. And I wanted to touch on corruption since you mentioned it. The U.S. government's going to be hosting the 10th Conference of State Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption, December 11 to 15 in Atlanta, Georgia. There's an NGO sign-on. It's a global NGO sign-on letter. NRDC and NWC signed it. It originated from the UNSAC Civil Society Coalition's Environmental Crime and Corruption Working Group. I think you'd find it interesting in how it addresses some of these issues and makes the linkage to the value chains. But there's also an UNSAC Coalition submission, which I can share, that went today, touching on all these interconnected issues to the UNSAC cost. There's a lot of work in the world going on where there's convergence among climate, biodiversity, human rights, environment, and crime communities. And I think this sort of hits at the center of it. I'll come back to something else from the U.S. government in a second. I just wanted to mention a few things.
Great, thanks for raising that, Scott. I think they're all, yeah, really critical things to be keeping in mind as we advance this, the IUCN levers, and how we can marry this accountability framework with the resolutions that we already have on the table, and then of course the importance of the corruption piece. I don't know if any questions, but if anyone also has comments or thoughts on any of this from your own work. Yeah, Zach. Realized I had to unmute you. I think you're good to go now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to thank you both for this presentation, and and I really respect both the work that both of you do, and I always learn something new. I guess what I'm curious about are two things. One is this idea of corruption. I think is always interesting because I think that there's a lot of corruption that goes on in the global north, but we just call it, the legal destruction of the planet, and somehow it's not looked at the same way. But at the end of the day, it's equally nefarious. And so I'm curious about any thoughts that you have about the double standard with respect to kind of the out and out corruption that takes place sometimes, or that there's a perception of that taking place in the global south versus the global north, where politicians are bought and sold. So I think that's one question. And then the other question is about equity. And KM, I really appreciated what you said about transparency and the need for the global north to be transparent in order to show that they're doing the same work that they're asking the global south to do. And I'm curious if that goes beyond transparency and goes to issues around finance and goes to bolder statements bolder actions, I should say, not statements, but bolder actions that align the resources of the global north. It's not just, I don't know what your perspective is, but for me, it's not just that the global north should be doing as much as the global south, it's that they should be doing even more, given the inequities that have existed for hundreds of years. So I'll just leave it there, and thanks again.
Thanks so much, Zach, for that. Really invaluable observations. Kim, I don't know if you want to start, and then I can follow up on the corruption in the global north.
Sure. Yeah. So firstly, yeah, it's interesting because when I was preparing this deck, I was like, do I want to use the C word? Because I think that it's something that's it's like the elephant in the room, especially in the Philippines, and across Indonesia and Malaysia. That is a huge issue and stymies all kind of progress around forest protection. And I think, yeah, I definitely think there needs to be more of a reframing around what's happening, again, because it's an equity issue, around what's kind of happening around corruption in the global north, as opposed to what's going on to the global south, because there is a lot of finger pointing, especially around, there's not just a lot of finger pointing, but I think that we're much more open, especially in the media, and I think the media has a really big role around this, of talking about corruption in the global south, but not talking about it in the same kinds of terms of like dictators or tyrants, or like even the language that we hear around corruption in the global south is very different from what you see around the language in the global north. And I do think that it's steeped in colonialism, it's steeped in double standards. And so this is something that I would like to definitely see much more language around, and also seeing it as being alongside of what's going on with climate and biodiversity protection, because I don't think that corruption piece is given enough discussion, and especially from the global north, and in terms of driving what's happening in the global south. And so with regards to your second question or comment regarding equity, actually, Zach, can you remind me again, what was your point regarding equity in the second point? Because I had lots of thoughts about it and it's already gone. I should have taken notes.
Sorry. Yeah, no, it was just about the idea that the equity really demands that the global north do more than transparent, just, be transparent, but that it has to even do more, arguably, than the global south, given the inequities of hundreds of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, again, like the Philippines is a classic example. We've been under colonization since the 1600s. So, and if you look at what has driven from 95% forest cover to 3%, we're a very concrete example. We had the Spanish, and then we had the Americans, and then the Second World War basically sealed the deal. And what was left of our forest, we were at like 70, or no, we were down to like 50, 60% forest cover after the Second World War. And as a result of war reparations with Japan, and Japan having to rebuild, basically everything that was left, a big chunk of what was left, was then shipped to Japan. And that was also because of a corrupt dictatorship that we had in the Philippines. So we are a living, breathing example of what happens with inequities and what happens when the global north is influencing what's happening in the global south. And the other thing that I was going to say, and you kind of highlighted it, was that it's not just statements, it's actions. And it's not just pledges, but it's actually showing us the money, to quote Jerry Maguire or the other guy. But it was, that's been a really big part, and from a frontline level. And I a big part of what I've been working on, over the last few years, is really lobbying for and advocating for more Indigenous finance or more financing to Indigenous communities. And there's so many amazing pledges, which is a great start. And there are so many amazing pledges that are coming out. But what I find really challenging is that it's not out there. Like, we need to really look for it. And in terms of all the kind of resource shortages that we're dealing with on a very day-to-day level at CS, in Palawan, having to look so hard for all, there's been so many pledges in the last 2 years about millions and millions of dollars that apparently have been pledged for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And you would think that in a place like Palawan, specifically in the Philippines, we are actually very privileged. We are recognized as the last biodiversity frontier. We do have many INGOs that have come into Palawan and are doing work. And I'm assuming that a lot of them are getting a lot of the funding because we're not able to access it. There's, I was on a panel at the last COP with the environmental minister for the UK and for Canada, and I just said, can you put it on your website? Like, we just want to be able, like there's all these pledges for giving money, but where is it? So I think that there's a lot to be said for the need to simplify the process. If we want to be able to reach IPLCs, there needs to be a more direct way of us being able to access it. And that's what I was kind of talking about with the lack of kind of tried and tested mechanisms for actually bringing the money down to the grassroots. So yeah, anyway, I'm conscious that we're at time and I've spoken a lot.
Yeah, and Zach, I mean, on the corruption piece, I mean, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head, and that is a way of framing what this accountability framework does. It's just not, yeah, it's not termed corruption in the global north. But when you talk about, so much of the attention has been on illegal deforestation, and where is that happening? Well, it's in the tropics, because nothing in the global north is illegal. It's all under these legal regimes, and it's all greenlit because that's how they've constructed their own and global policy making. So neither illegal nor deforestation, thanks to how things are written out on the page. When the impacts on climate, on indigenous peoples, on biodiversity can be every bit as devastating as what's happening in the tropics. So what this really does is, without sort of, necessarily calling it corruption, is it basically serves to capture all of those things that the global north has been let off the hook for a very long time, through that very close association with logging industry and the way that industry has really dominated political decision making in places like Canada and places like Sweden, and starting to take things sort of out of the hands of policymakers who have not been looking at this from a perspective of equity and accountability, and really delivering on environmental exigencies, but have been sort of looking at this from a means of papering over their own impacts while pointing fingers at the global south. And that's really a big focus of this, while also bolstering those resources available to countries in the tropics as well, to be addressing ongoing challenges there, and giving money to organizations that do so much with so little. And maybe the last thing I'll say is just that as I mentioned there, and as KM very pointed out very well, is the fact that, a lot of what is happening in the global south, and a lot of the lack of ambition, it's maybe not 100% tied to this, but there is a lot of desire to see action from the global north. And until the global north actually moves the needle on some of these pieces, there's not going to be the willingness to be delivering on these commitments. And nor are the structures and the frameworks going to be as strong as they need to be. Because if you have a country like Canada trying to define its way out of degradation, saying, oh, it doesn't mean this thing, but then saying, hey, Indonesia, hey, Philippines, hey, Brazil, address your own degradation, that definition is never going to be as strong or capture the things that it actually needs to capture. So building in those stronger, consistent definitions that are actually aligned with the science, and building a marketplace and a private sector that is actually positioned to look at these supply chains comprehensively, rather than like doing a dance around supply chains from the global north and trying to accommodate that, which of course just stymies broader interconnected paradigm shifts. So maybe with that, I will leave it, because I know we're now past the top of the hour. But thank you again to IUCN. Thank you to Scott. Thank you, KM, for being part of this. And thank you to you all for joining today. And if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. There's also a sign-on letter of support from NGOs going around for the GDIF that we'll be delivering at the start of COP28. So please be in touch. Thank you all.
And there's more time. I just want to say thank you on behalf of the committee again. I also want to thank Debbie Good, the membership manager, who works with the committee and supports all these things. I think we'll put the recording up on the U.S. National Committee website, maybe use other channels. And there's a lot to continue the conversation on. I think looking at the road ahead, the preparations for the Abu Dhabi Congress are really already underway in some fashion. Going to embed some of these issues into the new program by IUCN and the agenda for the Abu Dhabi Congress. And time won't permit to talk about the State Department report to Biden on U.S. Illegal deforestation strategy. And I could talk at length about corruption, including in the global north, and particularly the U.S. and all the strong tools the U.S. has that are both domestic and international. The U.S. actually does apply these at home as well. But this is great. Thank you all so much. And we'll try and do another one.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.